Mark Bennett, a wealthy Las Vegas casino tycoon known for his ruthless ambition and empty personal life, was surprised when his friend Jake challenges him to spend a weekend with Evelyn, an elderly homeless woman. Mark reluctantly accepts, expecting it to be just another bet. However, as Mark delves into Evelyn's world, he begins to see life from a new perspective. Mark was a man of extremes. At 38 years old, he had climbed to the top of Las Vegas's glittering empire, reigning as a casino tycoon. His empire, the Mirage Palace, wasn't just a casino. It was a monument to his success, towering over the Strip with an air of opulence that only money could buy. Mark was known for his sharp mind and even sharper business tactics. He had turned the struggling casino into a must-visit destination, luring in the wealthy and powerful with promises of luxury and excess. But for all the wealth he had accumulated, Mark Bennett's life was as barren as the desert that surrounded his kingdom. The penthouse suite where he lived alone offered a breathtaking view of the city that never slept, but Mark himself hardly noticed it anymore. To him, the bright lights and endless noise were just the background to a life that had grown increasingly empty. His days were filled with meetings, deals, and the constant hum of the casino floor beneath his feet. But when the night came, and the silence crept in, there was no one to share it with. Mark wasn't always this way. There was a time when he had cared deeply for people. His parents, his college friends, even a woman he thought he would marry. But that was before the allure of money and power had consumed him. Over time, he had become what the city demanded of him: ruthless, calculating, and alone. Relationships were risks, and risks were for the gamblers who sat at his tables, not for the man who owned them. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting a golden glow over the city, Mark found himself in the private poker room of his casino. The stakes were high, as they always were when Mark played. His competitors that night were a mix of old money, new tech millionaires, and his longtime friend and rival, Jake Thornton. Jake was everything Mark was not: charming, sociable, and effortlessly likable. They had known each other for years, their friendship built on a mutual respect for the game and a shared history of always pushing each other to the limit. As the game wore on, the tension at the table grew, but it was clear to everyone that the real showdown was between Mark and Jake. The others folded, leaving the two men to stare each other down. The pot was huge, enough to make any man nervous, but Mark's face was a mask of calm. He knew Jake's tells, just as Jake knew his. But tonight, something was different. Jake had a gleam in his eye that Mark hadn't seen before. It was as if he knew something Mark didn't. As the last card was dealt, Jake leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You know, Mark," Jake said, his voice smooth as silk, "we've been doing this dance for a long time, but I think it's time we up the ante." Mark raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued. "What are you suggesting?" Jake's smile widened. "How about a different kind of gamble? Something a little more interesting." Mark's curiosity was piqued, but he was wary. Jake was not one to propose a bet unless he was sure he had the upper hand. "I'm listening," Mark replied cautiously. Jake leaned forward, his eyes locked on Mark's. "Spend a weekend with someone completely outside of your world. Someone who has nothing to do with the glitz and glamour of Vegas. Someone like Evelyn." Mark's expression hardened. "Who's Evelyn?" Jake's tone softened, his voice almost sincere. "She's an elderly homeless woman I've seen around the city for years. She's got stories, Mark, stories that might just teach you something about life that all this," he gestured around the luxurious room, "never could." Mark felt a flicker of irritation. "You're joking, right?" But Jake wasn't. "I'm serious, Mark. Spend a weekend with her. No business, no deals, just you and Evelyn. If you can do it, you win. If not, well, let's just say you might learn something valuable." Mark stared at Jake, trying to gauge his intentions. The bet was ridiculous, beneath him even, but there was a challenge in Jake's eyes, one that Mark couldn't ignore. Mark had never backed down from a challenge in his life, and he wasn't about to start now. "Fine," Mark said, his voice clipped. "You're on. But don't expect me to come back with any heartwarming stories." Jake just smiled, leaning back in his chair, satisfied. "We'll see, Mark. We'll see." As the game resumed, Mark couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in the pit of his stomach. He had taken on countless risks in his life, but this was something different. Little did he know, this bet would be the one that changed everything. The next day, Mark couldn't stop thinking about Jake's challenge. He replayed the conversation over and over in his head, trying to figure out what Jake's angle was. Spending a weekend with an elderly homeless woman named Evelyn seemed absurd, but Mark knew Jake too well. There was always a deeper meaning behind his actions. It wasn't just a bet, it was a test, and Mark wasn't one to back down. By Friday afternoon, Mark had made up his mind. He would go through with the bet, prove Jake wrong, and come back to his world with another victory under his belt. He instructed his assistant to clear his schedule for the weekend and arrange for a driver to take him to Evelyn's usual spot near the older, less glamorous part of the city. It was a side of Las Vegas that Mark had rarely seen, a far cry from the polished luxury of the Mirage Palace. The sun was beginning to set as Mark's sleek, black car rolled through the neglected streets of the downtown area. The neon lights were fewer here, the noise of the city softer, replaced by the hum of people trying to survive another day. Mark felt out of place in his tailored suit and polished shoes, but he forced himself to ignore the discomfort. He was here to win a bet, nothing more. As the car came to a stop, Mark spotted her, Evelyn. She was sitting on a worn-out bench near a small park, bundled up in layers of mismatched clothing. Her gray hair was tied back in a loose bun, and her weathered face bore the marks of a life lived hard. She was exactly as Jake had described, frail, with a dignity that seemed out of place in her surroundings. Taking a deep breath, Mark stepped out of the car and approached her. Evelyn looked up as he approached, her eyes sharp and curious, but she said nothing. Mark hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Evelyn?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. She nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving his. "Who's asking?" "I'm Mark Bennett. I'm here because of Jake. He asked me to spend the weekend with you." Evelyn's expression didn't change, but Mark thought he saw a flicker of amusement in her eyes. Did he now? "And why would a man like you want to spend time with someone like me?" Mark shifted uncomfortably, not used to being on the defensive. It's a bet. Jake challenged me, and I never turned down a challenge." Evelyn let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. "A bet? Of course. And what exactly are you supposed to learn from this bet, Mr. Bennett?" Mark bristled at her tone, but quickly reminded himself that he was here for a reason. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm here, and I plan to see this through." Evelyn studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Finally, she stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. "All right, Mr. Bennett, let's see what you're made of." Without another word, she turned and began walking down the street, leaving Mark to follow. He quickly caught up to her, trying to match her pace without appearing impatient. As they walked, Mark couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between their worlds. The streets were lined with dilapidated buildings, their once bright facades now faded and cracked. The people they passed wore expressions of weariness, their eyes downcast as they hurried about their business. It was a side of Vegas that Mark had never really acknowledged, a world he had always been too busy to see. Evelyn led him to a small diner at the corner of the street. The sign above the door was missing a few letters, and the windows were clouded with age. Mark hesitated at the entrance, but Evelyn pushed the door open and walked in, motioning for him to follow. Inside, the diner was a picture of nostalgia, faded red booths, a jukebox in the corner, and a waitress who looked like she had been working there since the place opened. Evelyn slid into a booth, and Mark followed suit. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with a kind smile, brought over 2 cups of coffee without asking, giving Evelyn a nod of recognition. Mark watched as Evelyn took a sip, savoring the warmth. "Best coffee in town," she said, her eyes twinkling as she looked at Mark. "Not that you'd know, of course." Mark ignored the jab, focusing on the task at hand. "So, Evelyn, what's your story? How did you end up here?" Evelyn leaned back in the booth, her expression turning serious. "That's a long story, Mr. Bennett. Longer than a weekend, that's for sure. But if you're really interested, I'll tell you a bit." Mark nodded, leaning forward slightly. "I'm listening." Evelyn stared out the window, her eyes distant as she began to speak. "I wasn't always on the streets, you know. Once upon a time, I had a life. A husband, a home, even a little business of my own. But that was a long time ago. The world has a way of taking things from you when you least expect it." She paused, taking another sip of her coffee. Mark remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "My husband and I, we had a small shop downtown. We sold antiques, mostly little trinkets, furniture, things that had stories of their own. It wasn't much, but it was ours, and we were happy. But then, the recession hit. Business dried up, the bills piled up, and before we knew it, we lost everything. My husband, he couldn't handle it. He got sick, and without the money for proper care, he passed away." Evelyn's voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of pain that Mark couldn't ignore. He had heard stories like this before, but they had always seemed distant, almost abstract. Hearing it from Evelyn made it real. "And so, here I am," she continued. "No money, no family, just me and the streets. But you know what, Mr. Bennett? I've learned a lot out here. More than I ever did when I had a roof over my head." Mark felt a pang of guilt as he listened. He had spent years building his empire, focused only on success, never thinking about the people who had lost everything while he thrived. It was a sobering thought, one that made him uncomfortable. "So, what is it that you're supposed to teach me?" Mark asked, his voice quieter now. Evelyn looked at him, her gaze piercing. "I'm not here to teach you anything, Mark. That's for you to figure out. But maybe, just maybe, you'll find that there's more to life than what you've been chasing." Mark didn't have an answer for that. The conversation had taken a turn he wasn't prepared for, and he was left with a growing unease that he couldn't shake. For the first time in a long while, Mark felt like he was in over his head. As the evening wore on, they talked more about life, loss, and the city that had been both their home and their downfall. Evelyn's stories were a mix of heartbreak and resilience, painting a picture of a life that had been battered by circumstances but not broken. Mark listened, really listened, and for the first time, he began to see the world through someone else's eyes. The night ended with Evelyn leading Mark to a small, run-down motel where she often stayed when she could scrape together the money. Mark offered to pay for her room, but Evelyn refused, insisting that she could manage. Reluctantly, Mark let her be, retreating to his own upscale hotel room that now felt strangely cold and empty. As he lay in bed that night, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that Jake's challenge was more than just a bet. It was a turning point, a moment where Mark would have to confront the emptiness that had been creeping into his life for years. And for the first time, Mark wasn't sure if he was ready for what he might find. Saturday morning in Las Vegas was usually a time when the city was just beginning to stir from its late-night escapades. For Mark, it was typically a day filled with meetings or luxurious relaxation. But this Saturday was different. As he dressed in more casual clothes, jeans and a plain shirt, he felt out of place in his own skin, still adjusting to the challenge Jake had laid before him. Mark had spent a restless night, his mind spinning with Evelyn's words and the stark contrast between their lives. He had never considered the lives of people like her, those who lived in the shadows of the city he had conquered. But now, he was about to spend an entire weekend walking in her world. When he met Evelyn at the diner, she greeted him with a knowing smile, as if she could see right through the facade he had carefully crafted over the years. They had a quick breakfast, just coffee and toast for Mark, while Evelyn savored a hearty meal as though it was a rare treat. There was no small talk, just a simple exchange of plans for the day. Evelyn decided to take Mark to some of the places that had become part of her daily routine. They started at the local soup kitchen, a modest building tucked away in a backstreet far from the tourist attractions. The volunteers greeted Evelyn warmly, and she introduced Mark as a friend. He noticed the way people's faces softened when they saw Evelyn, a mixture of respect and affection that took him by surprise. Mark followed her into the bustling kitchen, where the scent of cooking food filled the air. Evelyn rolled up her sleeves and joined in, helping to prepare meals for those who would come in later. Mark hesitated, then followed suit, awkwardly chopping vegetables under Evelyn's watchful eye. As they worked, Evelyn explained how the soup kitchen had become a lifeline for many, including herself. "You'd be surprised, Mark," she said, her hands deftly slicing through a carrot, at how much a hot meal and a kind word can mean to someone who is nothing else. Mark nodded, but he didn't speak. The truth was, he didn't know what to say. This was a world that was completely foreign to him, one where people struggled for basic necessities that he took for granted. After the meals were prepared and served, they spent the rest of the morning visiting various shelters and community centers. Evelyn seemed to know everyone, and Mark was struck by the sense of community among people who had so little. They shared stories, laughter, and even tears, treating each other with a warmth and generosity that Mark had rarely seen in his own world. At one point, they sat in a small park, watching children play on a rusty swing set. Evelyn, sitting on a bench, looked content, her eyes reflecting the joy of simple pleasures. "Do you ever miss it?" Mark asked, unable to keep the question to himself any longer. "Your old life, I mean." Evelyn took a moment before answering. "Of course I do, sometimes. I miss my husband. I miss the feeling of security, of knowing I had a place in the world. But that life is gone, and there's no use in dwelling on what you can't change. The streets teach you that either you adapt or you get swallowed up by the despair." Mark listened, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. He had always believed that success was everything, that if you had money, power, and influence, you had it all. But here was Evelyn, someone who had lost everything, and yet she seemed more at peace than he had been in years. As the day went on, Evelyn took Mark to one of the most unexpected places, a small, run-down library that many had forgotten existed. The shelves were lined with worn-out books, their spines cracked from years of use. The librarian, an elderly man with glasses perched on the edge of his nose, greeted Evelyn with a smile and offered Mark a book as a welcome. "This place," Evelyn said softly, "is where I come when I need to escape. Sometimes, when you're out there on the streets, the world feels too big, too overwhelming. But here, in these pages, I can go anywhere, be anyone." Mark picked up a book at random, flipping through the yellowed pages. He had never thought of books as an escape, more as tools for learning, for self-improvement. But as he looked at Evelyn, he realized that for her, these stories were a lifeline, a connection to a world that was once within her reach. They spent the afternoon in silence, each absorbed in a book. Mark found himself drawn into the story, losing track of time until the sun dipped low in the sky. It was a strange, unfamiliar feeling. This peace, this contentment that had nothing to do with wealth or power. That evening, Evelyn took Mark to the neon boneyard, a graveyard for the city's retired signs. The glowing remnants of Vegas's past lay scattered across the yard, their lights dim but still flickering with life. Evelyn walked among them as if they were old friends, her fingers brushing the edges of the neon tubes. "I come here sometimes when I want to remember," she said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "This city used to be something else, you know, before the corporations took over, before everything became about the bottom line. There was a time when Vegas had a soul, a spirit that was wild and free. It wasn't just about money, it was about people, about dreams." Mark followed her gaze, taking in the faded grandeur of the signs. He had never thought about the history of the city in this way. To him, Vegas was a machine, a well-oiled, money-making machine. But now, as he stood there with Evelyn, he began to see it differently. He saw the stories, the dreams, and the lives that had built this city, and the ones that had been left behind. As they sat on a bench, watching the lights of the old signs flicker in the twilight, Mark felt a sense of calm wash over him. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time, a sense of being connected to something greater than himself. For once, he wasn't thinking about deals, profits, or the next big move. He was just there. "I never imagined spending a weekend like this," Mark admitted quietly. Evelyn smiled, her eyes full of wisdom. "That's the thing about life, Mark. It surprises you when you least expect it. You think you know what's important, what you want, but sometimes it takes a little nudge to see what you've been missing all along." Mark looked at her, really looked at her, and saw more than just an old woman who had fallen on hard times. He saw a survivor, someone who had lived through more than he could imagine, and yet still found joy in the little things, still held on to hope. As the night deepened, They left the neon boneyard and walked back through the city streets. The bright lights of the strip were visible in the distance, but they felt like a world away. Mark offered to walk Evelyn back to her spot, and she accepted, her steps slow but steady. When they reached her bench, Evelyn turned to Mark with a look of gratitude. "Thank you, Mark," she said softly, "for listening, for seeing me." Mark didn't know how to respond. He had come into this weekend thinking it was just another bet, another challenge to conquer. But now, he realized it was something much more, a lesson he hadn't known he needed. "You're welcome, Evelyn," he replied, his voice sincere. "I'm the one who should be thanking you." Evelyn just smiled and settled onto her bench, her small bag beside her. Mark hesitated for a moment, then turned to leave, feeling the weight of everything he had seen and heard that day. As he walked back to his hotel, the lights of the strip grew brighter, but they didn't hold the same allure they once did. The glamour, the wealth, the power. It all seemed hollow now, compared to the depth of what he had experienced with Evelyn. For the first time in his life, Mark Bennett felt the stirrings of something he couldn't quite name. A need to connect, to understand, to find meaning beyond the life he had built. And he knew that this weekend was just the beginning. Sunday dawned with the usual fanfare of bright lights and bustling tourists, but for Mark Bennett, the day felt different. He woke up in his luxurious hotel room, surrounded by the trappings of success, but his thoughts were on Evelyn and the world he had glimpsed through her eyes. The things that had once mattered so much to him, his wealth, his status, his empire, seemed distant, almost insignificant. Today was the day he would take Evelyn to a place that, until now, had been exclusively his, the world of the elite. The idea had come to him the night before, as they sat in the neon boneyard. He wanted to see how his world would react to someone like Evelyn, and more importantly, how Evelyn would react to his world. It was a charity gala, one of the many that Mark's casino hosted to maintain its polished image. These events were more about networking and flaunting wealth than genuine philanthropy, but they served their purpose. Mark had been to dozens of these galas, always surrounded by the city's most powerful and influential figures, all of them eager to outshine one another. But tonight would be different. Tonight, he would bring Evelyn. As the day progressed, Mark found himself growing increasingly anxious. He wasn't worried about what his peers would think. He had long since stopped caring about their opinions. What unsettled him was the uncertainty of how Evelyn would be treated and how she would feel. He had seen how kind she was to those in her world, but he had also seen the hardness in her eyes when she spoke of the people who had looked down on her. That evening, Mark arrived at Evelyn's bench just as the sun was setting. She looked up at him with a curious expression, clearly surprised to see him dressed in a sleek tuxedo, holding a garment bag in one hand. "What's all this, Mark?" she asked, her tone light but tinged with suspicion. "I want you to come with me to a charity gala tonight," Mark replied, offering her the garment bag. "I had this dress picked out for you. I think you'll look great in it." Evelyn hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Why, Mark? Why do you want me to go with you to one of your fancy parties?" Mark took a deep breath. "Because I want them to see you. I want them to see the real you, not just the image they have in their heads. And because I think you deserve a night where you're treated like the person you truly are." Evelyn studied him for a long moment, her gaze probing. Finally, she nodded. "All right, Mark, I'll go. But only because I'm curious to see what your world is really like." They returned to the hotel, where Mark had arranged for a room and a stylist to help Evelyn get ready. As she disappeared into the room, Mark paced the hallway, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what he was trying to prove, if it was to Jake, to himself, or to the people he had spent his life trying to impress. But he knew that this night would be different from any other gala he had ever attended. When Evelyn emerged, Mark was struck silent. The dress, a simple yet elegant gown in deep blue, fit her perfectly, accentuating her graceful, if weathered, frame. Her gray hair was styled in soft waves, and the makeup subtly highlighted her sharp features. For a moment, she looked like she belonged in his world, and Mark felt a pang of something he couldn't quite identify. Evelyn caught his expression and smiled wryly. "I clean up pretty well, don't I?" Mark found his voice. "You look incredible, Evelyn." She laughed softly. "Well, Let's see what your friends think. The gala was held in one of the grand ballrooms of the Mirage Palace, the chandelier-lit space filled with the city's wealthiest and most powerful. As Mark entered with Evelyn on his arm, the room seemed to pause for a moment, as if trying to process what they were seeing. Whispers rippled through the crowd as eyes darted in their direction. Mark's usual confidence faltered under the weight of their judgmental gazes, but he steeled himself, offering Evelyn his arm as they made their way through the throng. "Who is she?" he heard someone murmur behind them. "Did you see who Mark brought?" "She's not one of us," another voice whispered. Mark's inner circle, a group of polished, well-dressed men and women, approached with practiced smiles that didn't reach their eyes. At the forefront was Amanda Sterling, a sharp-tongued socialite who had always been eager to impress Mark with her wit and charm. "Mark," Amanda said, her voice oozing with faux concern as she glanced at Evelyn. "So good to see you. And who might this be?" Mark met her gaze steadily. "This is Evelyn. She's my guest tonight." Amanda's eyes flicked over Evelyn, her expression shifting to one of barely concealed disdain. "How interesting." Evelyn, sensing the undercurrent, smiled politely. "It's nice to meet you." Amanda didn't bother to hide her skepticism. "And where are you from, Evelyn?" "The streets," Evelyn replied simply, her tone calm and unwavering. "But I've lived all over the city." The awkward silence that followed was palpable. Mark could see the discomfort in Amanda's eyes, but Evelyn remained composed, refusing to be intimidated by the judgment surrounding her. It was a side of Evelyn that Mark hadn't seen before, a quiet strength that made him feel both proud and uneasy. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of awkward conversations and forced smiles. Mark watched as his friends struggled to engage with Evelyn, their discomfort growing more apparent with each passing moment. It was clear that they didn't know how to interact with someone who didn't fit into their world, someone who didn't play by their rules. Evelyn, for her part, handled the evening with grace. She answered questions with honesty, never trying to hide who she was or where she came from. But Mark could see the subtle ways in which she was being dismissed, the way people's eyes would glaze over when she spoke of her life on the streets, as if her experiences were too far removed from their own to be of any interest. As the night wore on, Mark found himself growing increasingly frustrated. He had hoped that bringing Evelyn here would open people's eyes, that they would see her as the remarkable woman he had come to know. But instead, they seemed more concerned with maintaining their own sense of superiority, with keeping Evelyn at arm's length. At one point, Mark overheard a conversation between two men in the corner of the room. "I can't believe Mark brought her here," one of them said, his tone dripping with condescension. "What's he trying to prove?" "Maybe he's lost it," the other replied with a smirk. "Or maybe he's just bored with all this and wanted to shake things up." Mark's fists clenched at his sides, a surge of anger rising within him. But before he could react, Evelyn appeared at his side, her hand resting gently on his arm. "Don't," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. "It's not worth it." Mark looked at her, seeing the weariness in her expression, the way the evening had taken its toll. He realized then that this world, the world he had built his life around, wasn't worth the pain it was causing Evelyn. She had lived through more than these people could ever imagine, and yet here they were, judging her, dismissing her, as if she were nothing more than an oddity. The evening finally drew to a close, and Mark and Evelyn made their way out of the ballroom, the weight of judgment heavy on their shoulders. As they stepped out into the cool night air, Mark felt a wave of guilt and regret wash over him. "I'm sorry, Evelyn," he said quietly, unable to meet her eyes. "I shouldn't have brought you here." Evelyn sighed, her breath visible in the night air. "Don't be sorry, Mark. You meant well. But this isn't my world. And it isn't yours either. Not really." Mark looked at her, confusion clouding his features. "What do you mean?" Evelyn smiled sadly. "You've built your life around these people, around this image of success. But tonight, I think you saw what that really means. It's not about connection or understanding. It's about power, about keeping others out." Mark felt the truth of her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had spent years climbing to the top, only to find that the view wasn't as glorious as he had imagined. And now, seeing how his world had treated Evelyn, he couldn't help but question everything he had worked for. "I don't know what to do," Mark admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch warm and reassuring. "You'll figure it out, Mark. But just remember, what really matters isn't what you have, but who you are, and who you choose to be." As they walked back to Evelyn's bench, Mark felt a sense of clarity beginning to emerge from the chaos of his thoughts. For so long, he had believed that his worth was tied to his wealth, to his ability to succeed in a world that demanded perfection. But now, he was beginning to see that true success wasn't about the number in his bank account or the size of his empire. It was about something much deeper, something he had lost sight of along the way. The days after the gala passed in a haze for Mark Bennett. The polished surface of his life, once so secure, so unassailable, was beginning to crack. He moved through his daily routines with a sense of detachment, his mind continually returning to Evelyn's words and the harsh truth they carried. The glamour of his world felt hollow. The respect he once commanded now tinged with an awareness of its fragility. By Thursday, Mark knew he had to see Evelyn again, not just to fulfill the remaining time of Jake's challenge, but because he needed to understand more. He needed to hear more of her story, to learn from the wisdom she had acquired through a life he could hardly comprehend. He found Evelyn in her usual spot, sitting on her bench with a small paperback book in hand. She looked up as he approached, her expression warm but curious. "Back for more?" she asked with a slight smile. Mark nodded, sitting down beside her. "If you'll have me." Evelyn chuckled softly, closing her book. "Of course, Mark. What's on your mind?" Mark hesitated, unsure of how to begin. There was so much he wanted to ask, so much he needed to say, but the words felt tangled in his throat. Finally, he settled on the simplest question. "How do you do it, Evelyn? How do you stay so strong after everything you've been through?" Evelyn was quiet for a moment, her gaze distant as she considered his question. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, but there was a deep current of emotion beneath it. "It's not about strength, Mark. It's about acceptance. When you lose everything, your home, your loved ones, your sense of security, it forces you to confront who you really are. You can't hide behind the things that used to define you. All you have left is yourself, and you have to make peace with that." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet intensity. "It wasn't easy. There were times when I wanted to give up, when the weight of it all felt too much to bear. But I learned that life has a way of teaching you, even in the hardest moments. You find out what really matters, and you hold on to that." Mark listened, feeling the weight of her words settle over him like a blanket. He had always believed that strength came from control, from mastering his environment and bending it to his will. But here was Evelyn, who had lost control of everything, and yet she seemed stronger, more at peace than anyone he knew. "I don't know if I could do what you've done," Mark admitted, his voice tinged with doubt. "I've spent my whole life chasing success, trying to build something that would last. But now I'm not even sure what it was all for." Evelyn placed a gentle hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "You're not alone in that, Mark. We all have to figure out what truly matters to us. Sometimes, it takes losing everything to see clearly. But you don't have to lose it all to understand. You just have to be willing to look deeper." Mark felt a lump form in his throat as he thought about what he had lost. Not in terms of money or status, but in terms of connection, of meaning. He had pushed people away, isolated himself in his pursuit of success, and now, for the first time, he was beginning to see the cost. As they sat in companionable silence, Evelyn suddenly shifted, her expression becoming more serious. "Mark, there's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice steady but with a hint of gravity that made Mark's heart skip a beat. "What is it?" he asked, his concern evident. Evelyn took a deep breath, her eyes locking with his. "I wasn't always homeless. I told you before that I lost everything, but there's more to the story." Mark listened intently as Evelyn began to speak, her words slow and measured, as if she were carefully choosing each one. "I was once a businesswoman, just like you," she said, her voice carrying the weight of years gone by. "I had a thriving business, a family, a home, everything I thought I needed to be happy. My husband and I worked hard, built our life from the ground up. But when the 2008 financial crisis hit, we were caught off guard. We lost everything: our savings, our business, our home. Mark's eyes widened as he listened, realizing that Evelyn's story was more complex than he had imagined. She wasn't just a woman who had fallen on hard times. She was someone who had been to the top and then seen it all come crashing down. My husband took it the hardest, Evelyn continued, her voice softening as she spoke of him. He was always the strong one, the provider. But when everything fell apart, so did he. He couldn't handle the shame, the loss. He started drinking, withdrawing from everyone and everything. I tried to hold us together, but it wasn't enough. He passed away a few years later, and after that, well, I just didn't have the strength to rebuild. I ended up on the streets, and I've been there ever since. There was a long pause as Mark absorbed her words. He could see the pain etched into Evelyn's face, the deep scars left by the loss of her husband and the life they had built together. But there was also a quiet resilience, a strength that came not from conquering the world, but from surviving it. Evelyn, I'm so sorry, Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. I can't even begin to imagine what that must have been like. Evelyn shook her head gently. Don't be sorry, Mark. It was hard, yes, but it taught me things I never would have learned otherwise. I learned about humility, about resilience, about the kindness of strangers. And most importantly, I learned that life isn't about what you have. It's about who you are when everything is stripped away. Mark felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, but he blinked them back, trying to keep his emotions in check. Evelyn's story was a mirror, reflecting the fears and insecurities he had buried deep within himself. He had always been terrified of losing everything, of being exposed as a fraud who couldn't maintain the empire he had built. But here was Evelyn, who had lost it all, and yet had emerged with a clarity of purpose that he envied. Evelyn, I don't know how you do it, Mark said, shaking his head in disbelief. You've been through so much, and yet you're still standing. You still find joy in the little things, still connect with people. I've spent so long building walls around myself, and now I'm realizing how empty it's made me. Evelyn smiled, a sad but understanding smile. You're starting to see it, Mark. The things we think matter, money, power, status, they're just distractions. What really matters is how we treat each other, how we live our lives when no one's watching. Mark nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle deep in his soul. He had spent years chasing after success, never stopping to question whether it was worth the cost. But now, with Evelyn's story as a guide, he was beginning to see that there was more to life than what he had been pursuing. Evelyn, Mark said, his voice trembling slightly, if there's anything I can do for you, anything at all? Evelyn shook her head again, her smile softening. You've already done more than you know, Mark. You've listened, you've seen me for who I am, not just for what I appear to be. That's more valuable than any amount of money or charity. Mark felt a lump in his throat as he looked at Evelyn, realizing how much she had given him in just a few short days. She had opened his eyes to a world he had never really seen, a world where strength wasn't measured in wealth or power, but in the ability to endure, to find meaning in even the hardest of times. But then Evelyn's expression shifted, and Mark noticed a hint of sadness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She took a deep breath, as if preparing herself for something difficult. There's one more thing, Mark, she said, her voice softer now, almost hesitant. I'm not going to be around much longer. Mark's heart skipped a beat, a cold dread settling in his chest. What do you mean? Evelyn looked away for a moment, her gaze distant, before meeting his eyes again. I'm sick, Mark. Terminally ill. I've known for a while now, but I've come to terms with it. I don't have much time left, maybe a few weeks, maybe a couple of months. The words hit Mark like a punch to the gut, leaving him breathless. He stared at Evelyn, struggling to process what she had just told him. In the short time he had known her, she had become so much more than just a part of a bet. She had become a friend, a mentor, someone who had shown him a side of life he had never known. No, Mark whispered, shaking his head. Evelyn, there has to be something we can do. I can get you the best doctors, the best care, whatever you need. Evelyn reached out and took his hand, her grip firm but gentle. Mark, I appreciate that. I really do. But there's nothing that can be done. I've lived a full life, and I'm at peace with what's coming. What I need now is not medical care. It's the company of a friend, someone who will be there with me in these last days. Tears welled up in Mark's eyes as he squeezed Evelyn's hand, his heart breaking for her. He had come into this challenge thinking it was just a game, just another way to prove himself. But now, it had become something so much more. An opportunity to truly connect, to be there for someone in a way he had never been for anyone else. I'll be here, Evelyn, Mark promised, his voice thick with emotion. I'll be here with you until the end. Evelyn smiled, a smile full of warmth and gratitude. Thank you, Mark. That means more to me than you'll ever know. As they sat together on the bench, the world around them faded into the background. The noise of the city, the bright lights, the relentless pace of life. None of it mattered anymore. All that mattered was the connection between them, the bond that had formed through shared stories, shared pain, and the understanding that in the end, it wasn't about winning or losing, but about how you lived and loved along the way. Mark knew that the days ahead would be difficult, that watching Evelyn's health decline would be one of the hardest things he had ever done. But he also knew that it was the most important thing he could do, that being there for Evelyn in her final days was a gift, a chance to give back some of the kindness and wisdom she had shown him. And so, as the sun began to set on that autumn evening, Mark made a silent vow to himself. He would not waste the lessons Evelyn had taught him. He would honor her life by changing his own, by finding a way to live with the same grace, humility, and strength that she had shown him. Because in the end, it wasn't about the money, the power, or the success. It was about the people you touched, the lives you changed, and the love you gave. And Mark Bennett was finally ready to start living that truth. Mark Bennett had never felt so powerless. Over the years, he had faced down competitors, won high-stakes deals, and built an empire. But none of that had prepared him for the helplessness he felt now. The reality of Evelyn's illness weighed heavily on him, a constant reminder that there were some things in life that no amount of money or influence could fix. As the weeks passed, Mark became a fixture in Evelyn's life. He spent as much time as he could with her, often bringing her favorite meals, sitting with her on the bench where they first met, or simply keeping her company as she rested in the modest motel room she had come to rely on. The conversations they shared during those days were some of the most profound Mark had ever experienced. They spoke about everything: life, death, love, regrets, and the things that truly mattered when the end was near. Evelyn's health continued to decline, and it became increasingly clear that she didn't have much time left. Mark struggled with the impending loss, but he kept his promise, remaining by her side, doing everything he could to make her final days comfortable. Despite her weakening condition, Evelyn maintained her dignity, facing her fate with a calm acceptance that both inspired and humbled Mark. One evening, as they sat together watching the sun set over the city, Evelyn turned to Mark with a serious expression. She looked frilier than ever, her skin pale, her breathing shallow, but her eyes still held that sharp clarity he had come to admire. "Mark, there's something I need you to do for me," Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark leaned in closer, concern etched on his face. "Anything, Evelyn. Just tell me." Evelyn hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. "When I'm gone, I want you to make sure that my story doesn't end with me. I want you to take what I've taught you and do something with it. Use your resources, your influence, to help others who are in the same position I was in. The homeless, the forgotten, the ones who have slipped through the cracks." Mark felt a lump form in his throat, and he nodded, struggling to speak. "I promise, Evelyn. I'll do whatever I can to make sure your legacy lives on." Evelyn smiled weakly, a look of relief washing over her features. "Good. That's all I ask. I don't want to be remembered for what I lost, but for what I tried to hold on to. My humanity, my compassion. If you can carry that forward, then I'll know my life wasn't in vain." Mark swallowed hard, his heart aching with the weight of her words. He had never considered himself a compassionate man. His world had taught him that compassion was a weakness, something to be exploited. But now, sitting beside Evelyn, he understood how wrong he had been. True strength wasn't about power or control. It was about kindness, about the willingness to help others even when you had nothing left to give. The next morning, Mark woke up to a text from the motel manager. Evelyn had passed away in her sleep, peacefully, just as she had hoped. Mark felt a wave of grief crash over him, the finality of her absence hitting him harder than he had anticipated. He had known this moment was coming, had tried to prepare himself, but nothing could have softened the blow. Mark made the necessary arrangements, ensuring that Evelyn received a proper burial. It was a simple service, attended by a few of the people she had known in her later years, volunteers from the soup kitchen, staff from the shelter, and some of the regulars from the park where she spent her days. As the small group gathered around her grave, Mark couldn't help but feel the enormity of the task Evelyn had left him. She had entrusted him with her legacy, and he was determined not to let her down. In the days following Evelyn's funeral, Mark threw himself into the task of fulfilling her final request. He used his considerable resources to set up a foundation in her name, dedicated to helping the homeless and providing support for those in need. He worked tirelessly, leveraging his connections to secure funding, organize events, and spread awareness of the cause that had become so important to him. But it wasn't just about money. Mark knew that real change required more than just throwing cash at a problem. It required understanding, empathy, and a commitment to making a difference. He spent time in the shelters, talking to the people who had been in Evelyn's position, listening to their stories, and learning from their experiences. He made sure that the foundation's efforts were rooted in the realities of life on the streets, not just in the good intentions of those who had never known such hardship. As the foundation grew, so did Mark's reputation, but in a way he had never experienced before. People began to see him not just as a wealthy tycoon, but as someone who genuinely cared, someone who was using his influence for good. The transformation was slow, but it was real, and Mark found himself feeling more fulfilled than he ever had in his years of running the casino. One evening, after a long day of meetings and planning, Mark returned to the bench where he and Evelyn had spent so many hours together. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the city. He sat down, taking a deep breath, and allowed himself to feel the full weight of everything that had happened. The loss, the lessons, the change that had taken root in his heart. As he sat there, he thought about how much his life had changed since that fateful night when Jake had challenged him to a bet. What had started as a simple gamble had become the most important experience of his life, one that had led him down a path he never could have predicted. Mark's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Jake, asking to meet. Mark hesitated for a moment, then typed a quick reply. "Let's meet at the bench." When Jake arrived, he found Mark sitting in quiet contemplation, the city lights beginning to twinkle in the distance. Jake took a seat beside him, a curious expression on his face. "You've been busy," Jake said, breaking the silence. Mark nodded, still staring out at the horizon. "Yeah, there's a lot to do." Jake looked at him, his gaze searching. "You've changed, Mark." Mark turned to face his old friend, a small smile playing on his lips. "I guess I have, but I think it's for the better." Jake leaned back on the bench, his expression thoughtful. "I have to admit, when I first made that bet, I didn't think you'd actually go through with it. And I definitely didn't think it would lead to this." Mark chuckled softly. "Neither did I, but I'm glad you pushed me to do it. It's the best thing that ever happened to me." Jake nodded, his respect for Mark evident in his eyes. "I'm proud of you, Mark. You've done something incredible here." Mark shook his head, his expression serious. "It wasn't just me, Jake. It was Evelyn. She was the one who changed me, who showed me what really matters. I'm just trying to live up to the example she set." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of everything that had transpired settling over them. Finally, Jake spoke again, his voice soft. "So, what's next for you, Mark? Where do you go from here?" Mark thought about the question for a moment, his gaze drifting back to the city skyline. "I'm going to keep working on the foundation, keep helping people, but I'm also going to take some time to figure out who I want to be. For so long, I defined myself by my success, by the empire I built. But now I want to find out what else is out there, what else I can do." Jake smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I think you're going to do great things, Mark. And if you ever need help, you know where to find me." Mark smiled back, feeling a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. Thanks, Jake. I appreciate that. As the two friends sat on the bench, watching the city come alive with lights and energy, Mark felt a deep sense of contentment. He had lost a lot: his old life, his old identity, but in doing so, he had found something far more valuable. He had found a purpose, a way to honor Evelyn's memory and carry her legacy forward. And in the process, he had discovered a new way of living, one that was richer, more meaningful, and filled with the kind of connections he had once believed were beyond his reach. The final gamble had been won, not through power or wealth, but through compassion, understanding, and the simple act of caring for another human being. And for Mark Bennett, that was a victory worth more than anything he had ever achieved. The foundation Mark Bennett had created in Evelyn's name grew quickly, its influence spreading far beyond the borders of Las Vegas. What began as a modest effort to honor a single woman's legacy blossomed into a movement that touched countless lives. Mark poured his heart and soul into the work, finding a sense of purpose that he had never known before. He became a man transformed, unrecognizable from the tycoon who once ruled over the glittering strip with cold efficiency. But it wasn't just the foundation that changed Mark. It was the people he met along the way. He spent more time with the homeless community, learning their stories, their struggles, and their dreams. He visited shelters, organized food drives, and worked alongside volunteers who shared his passion for making a difference. Mark's presence at these events became a regular occurrence, and it wasn't long before the city began to notice the shift in its once aloof casino mogul. As Mark continued his work, he found himself increasingly disillusioned with the world he had once dominated. The casinos, the opulence, the endless pursuit of wealth, it all seemed so meaningless now. He began to pull back from his business empire, delegating more responsibilities to his trusted executives. He knew that his time was better spent elsewhere, in places where he could make a real difference. One day, as Mark was sorting through old files in his office, he came across a photograph that stopped him in his tracks. It was a picture of himself from years ago, standing in front of the Mirage Palace on the day it opened. He was younger then, full of ambition and pride, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of success. But now, as he looked at the photo, all he could see was a man who had been lost in the pursuit of something that ultimately didn't matter. Mark set the photo aside and leaned back in his chair, his thoughts drifting to Evelyn. He wondered what she would think of him now, of the choices he had made since her passing. He hoped she would be proud, that she would see how much she had influenced his life. As the months turned into a year, Mark's foundation expanded its reach. It opened new shelters, funded job training programs, and provided resources for those struggling with addiction and mental health issues. The work was challenging, often frustrating, but it was also deeply rewarding. For the first time in his life, Mark felt truly fulfilled, not by the size of his bank account, but by the knowledge that he was helping to change lives for the better. One evening, Mark found himself back at the bench where he had spent so many hours with Evelyn. The bench had become a sacred place for him, a spot where he could reflect on everything that had happened, where he could feel close to her. As he sat there, watching the sun set over the city, he thought about how much his life had changed and how much further he still had to go. A familiar voice broke the silence. "Mind if I join you?" Mark looked up to see Jake standing there, a smile on his face. Mark nodded, gesturing for Jake to sit beside him. The two friends sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains. "You've done good, Mark," Jake said after a while, his tone sincere. "You've really turned things around." Mark nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Thanks, Jake, but I still have a long way to go. There's so much more to do." Jake chuckled softly. "There always is. But you've made a difference, and that's what counts." Mark appreciated the words, but he knew that his work was far from finished. The foundation had made great strides, but the problems it addressed were deep and complex. It would take years, maybe even decades, to make a lasting impact, but Mark was committed to seeing it through. As the night grew darker, Mark turned to Jake, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You know, Jake, I never thanked you properly for that bet you made me take. It changed everything." Jake grinned, leaning back on the bench. I had a feeling it might. But honestly, Mark, you did all the hard work. You just needed a little push." Mark laughed, a genuine, heartfelt laugh that felt like it came from a place deep within him. "Yeah, I guess I did." The two men sat in companionable silence, the city lights twinkling around them. For Mark, this moment was a testament to how far he had come. Not just in the past year, but in his entire life. He had started as a man who measured his worth by his success, by the power he wielded over others. But now, he understood that true success was measured in the lives you touched, in the difference you made in the world. In the years that followed, Mark continued to build on the foundation he had laid. He sold off parts of his casino empire, using the proceeds to fund more projects aimed at helping the disadvantaged. He became an advocate for the homeless, speaking out on their behalf and working to change the policies that had left so many people behind. Mark's transformation did not go unnoticed. The media took an interest in his story, and soon, Mark Bennett was no longer just a casino tycoon. He was a philanthropist, a man who had turned his life around and was using his wealth and influence to help others. His story became an inspiration to many, showing that it was never too late to change, to find a new purpose in life. But for Mark, the real reward was in the quiet moments, like the ones he spent on that bench, thinking about Evelyn and the lessons she had taught him. He kept her memory alive in everything he did, always striving to live up to the example she had set. Her story had become his guiding star, leading him down a path he never could have imagined. One day, as Mark was leaving a shelter that the foundation had just opened, he was approached by a young woman. She looked nervous, but determined, and she introduced herself as someone who had been helped by the foundation. "I just wanted to thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I was in a really bad place, and your foundation saved my life. I don't know where I'd be without it." Mark felt a lump form in his throat as he listened to her words. He reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm glad we could help," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "And I'm even more glad that you found the strength to turn things around." The young woman smiled, tears welling up in her eyes. "You've done so much for people like me. You're a hero, Mr. Bennett." Mark shook his head, a humble smile on his face. "I'm no hero. I'm just someone who's trying to do the right thing." As he walked away, Mark couldn't help but think of Evelyn. He knew that she would be proud of the work he had done, of the lives that had been changed because of her influence. And in that moment, he felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that he was living the life he was meant to live. Mark Bennett's legacy would not be one of wealth or power, but of compassion, kindness, and a commitment to making the world a better place. He had taken the lessons Evelyn had taught him and turned them into something beautiful, something lasting. And as he continued on his journey, he knew that he would always carry her memory with him, guiding him, inspiring him, and reminding him of what truly mattered. Because in the end, it wasn't about the gamble. It was about the life you chose to live.